like it. You want a podcast like it? Podcast like it's 1999. Podcast like it. Just podcast like it. Podcast like it's 1999. Podcast like it. You want a podcast like it's 1999.
Welcome to Podcasts Like It's 1999. I'm your host, Phil Iskov, and with us today is Pete Capella, actor, producer, and perhaps like I'm when you picked this album, I thought to myself, I haven't thought about this album in 20 years. Like it's an album that was ubiquitous and then kind of disappeared. And what I'm excited to talk about with this is its lasting legacy in a weird way and how it's got a longer tail than people perhaps give it credence for.
Yeah.
Like I think that you see it a lot more in music today than people perhaps want to acknowledge. Sort of what it comes down to. But before we get into all that, before we get into Moby's play and how big an album it was, where were you in 1999?
Okay. So this is like maybe the biggest transitional period of my life.
Right.
I graduated college in May of 1999 when Play was released. So I had gone from a school I'm from Central Jersey, right on the shore, Springsteen, Bon Jovi country. Like it is, that's all you hear. That's all anyone talks about. It's very much that. But there was always a really cool music scene. So I went to school in rural Maryland, at a place called Salisbury University. At the time it was called Salisbury State University, and there was a bajillion jokes about that.
I wasn't going to go there, but I found it.
Yeah. It was my safety school. And at the last minute, my parents decided they didn't want me to go 10 hours away to Ohio State, where I had gotten into the honors program and stuff. So I went to this school in Maryland. I was in this tiny little, Purdue is there. It's a chicken farm town. It smells like fucking chickens. It's that. So I went from that to moving back home and working in New York City. So that is a transition of my life where I went from small to, when I went there, I was like, I'm going to go to this school. I'm going to be there for a year. I'm going to transfer. But it was big fish, small pond syndrome. I had a radio show, a TV show. My entire senior year my class was me teaching improv. So it was an independent study. I didn't have to do anything. So it was like, I was in my glory, and I ate that up. So I'm in New York City. And so that's where I am. I'm in New York City and out of college and on my own for the first time in a very, very long time. So it's a really cool.
So you're in New York in 99. This is, obviously we've dedicated an entire podcast to this, but there is a shit ton of movies and music and television and all this sort of stuff that's going on in theater as well. And you're at the tip of the spear, right? You're in New York City during all of this. Are you getting a sense of sort of, because I know this episode will focus primarily on music, and this album being sort of a groundbreaking and strange album for all intents and purposes at the time. And music is going through a transition as well. We're seeing sort of Britney Spears and the pop explosion we're at the beginning of it, but it's obviously going to become just enormous. And in the process, it is washing away a decade or so of grunge and literally, figuratively, however you want to call it. And I'm sort of curious as to what it was like in New York musically, if you sort of had a sense of, or what you were listening to back then and how it sort of felt.
That's a very fair question. So I was in college radio, so I was just exposed to cool shit, even though I was in the middle of nowhere for a very long time. And so going to New York, I finally got to I was like, oh, I am at CBGB's. They talk about CBGB's. Now I'm here. I'm at all the music venues. Music is cool as shit in New York then, and I don't think. If you're in the know or at least have some sort of inkling of what you're doing, you're always going to find good music. But I'm also walking past TRL every single day.
Yeah.
So I'm selling radio airtime. Literally the joke that Billy Crystal does in
City Slickers.
in City Slickers. That's what I'm doing. I studied acting. I'm still doing improv and acting on the side, but I thought I owed my parents, like, you just paid for college, I should get a real job type thing. Right. And so I'm in this miserable job. And I'm walking past here and I'm watching those crowds grow and grow and grow as this boy band Britney Spears phenomenon is blowing up. And I don't know what to make of it. And so that is where Moby hits very hard for me.
Yeah.
So in school, like, or like at that point in time, like I love The Prodigy, but I thought I was too much of a pussy to listen to The Prodigy. Like it was just like an inkling too hard for me. So Moby just kind of fit right there, like Moby, and then eventually like Fatboy Slim and that whole genre. I felt like someone was letting me in on something cool that I did not know about before. Like, oh, this is what they're listening to, like in the basement of some club in New York right now. And I'm not cool enough to go there, but I can listen to it.
You know, it's funny. So I obviously listened to the album today for the first time in a very long time. And it was a very interesting experience. First of all, like, and we'll get into this, but this album, you know, one of its groundbreaking things was it was one of the first albums to really sell the songs for commercials, right? So this was like the perhaps its longest legacy is that it taught the music industry, wait a second, there's a whole revenue stream here that you are ignoring, and your songs can get play that, you know, that might not get play on the radio can get play in a commercial. So it was a very different animal. But to rewind a little bit, you know, electronic music, for all intents and purposes, I mean, you can go back obviously to the 80s. You know, you've got bands that are breaking ground in sort of the electronic, you know, I don't know what you would call it, lane of music. You know, your Depeche Modes, your whoever's that are sort of finding new ways to sort of fuck with, to sort of bring electronic into music. Now, what you didn't really have necessarily at this point were solely electronic bands. Like there were bands that were incorporating electronics into the use of instruments and other such things, right? Like you had a band and then you were sort of like fucking with it electronically. This was about like DJs. This was about like someone who is very close to my heart, and one of my favorite artists is Bjork. She releases Homogenic in 1998, which is, you know, some might argue her masterpiece.
You might argue.
I would argue that it's her masterpiece. She's someone who was just singing into a microphone and then fucking with her voice and adding beats to it. I mean, this was sort of the reason I bring this up is because Moby, who does that a little bit on this album, is also sampling. Like most of this album is samples.
Absolutely.
And sampling starts earlier, right? Like sampling starts with like hip hop and various other
for sure,
right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's what kind of appealed to me at the time was like, okay, I missed the Beastie Boys when they were really transitioning into what I love about the Beastie Boys, like Check Your Head, that whole era. And so now I'm like, what is the next step? What's the next thing that's happening? And to me, it was somehow combining college music, world music, and beats. And so, you know, it was just this different world that I had never been to before. And that's what really got me about the album. And if someone said, hey, Pete, are you a Moby fan? I'd be like, no, I have the one album and I listen to it nonstop. But like, and I don't hate the guy or anything. It was just like, this album was something so huge.
Yes. I mean, I just to sort of, because I feel like it needs to be said that you know, Moby said some pretty weird shit over the last couple of years. Put out a book, did a whole bunch of you know, pissed off a lot of people, understandably so. Made some odd comments about relationships that he thought he was in with Natalie Portman, for instance.
Yeah, that was the weirdest thing.
It was a very weird moment when everyone was like, what? Like, first of all, like no one was talking or thinking about Moby, and then all of a sudden this guy kind of resurfaces with a book of a sort of a confessional book of confessions that didn't exist, it seems. So
Right.
it was just a lot of stuff that was very strange. So just to kind of talk about that and just say, like, listen, I don't know Moby. I'm not even really sure why he's named Moby, but
Well, I'll tell you why.
Oh, great.
So his name is Richard Melville Hall, and so apparently he is the great nephew of Herman Melville. And so his dad, when he was very young, said Richard is too big of a name for a child, for a baby, so he started calling him Moby when he was like a few days old, and that was his nickname. Yeah. That is what I found. Who knows if that's true?
No, that sounds fair. That sounds true to me.
Yeah.
Sure. To give a little bit of context on Richard Melville Hall, a.k.a. Moby, he's an American musician, obviously, singer, songwriter, producer, animal rights activist, sold over 20 million records worldwide. AllMusic considers him to be amongst the most important dance music figures of the early 90s, helping bring dance music to the mainstream audiences, specifically in the UK and the United States. So he takes up guitar and piano when he's 9. He played in several underground punk rock bands through the 80s before turning to electronic dance music. In 89, he moves to New York City, becomes a prolific figure as a DJ, producer, remixer, what have you. He's got a single in 91 called Go that's a bit of a mainstream breakout hit, goes number 10 in the UK. 92 to 97, he scored a couple big hits on the dance floor for the most part. Move, You Make Me Feel So Good, Feeling So Real, James Bond theme, Moby reversion. Then he puts out a punk-oriented album called Animal Rights, which comes out in 96 and alienates basically everyone who listened to his music. And it seemed as though like it was basically done. But then he decides he's going to record one more album. It's going to be the last album that he does ever. And it happens to be Play. It's one of those albums that I guess it became an unexpected global hit in 2000. Every single track on the album was licensed to films, television shows, and commercials. It remains the highest selling album, his highest selling album, with 12 million copies sold. It's one of those albums that when I played it today, I felt like I saw just a flood of commercials and images and like music video. It triggered a very strange sort of response of nostalgia, and I gotta say, like, it was a nice experience. I didn't hate the album. My thing with it is like, okay, yes, like people were at the time, they were like, Moby's a total sellout. Yeah.
If 20 years later I can listen to that album and it elicits feelings that I felt in 1999, that's art doing its job. So he's maybe the last guy I want to defend, though I am a vegan, but I also have will never get awful vegan tattoos on my neck. They're so bad. I mean, get them, but make them better. They are really bad. It's one of those things where he created this beautiful, what is there, like 15 tracks on the album, something like that, and like, I'm along for the ride on every single one of those. And like, you're 9 or 10 tracks deep, and then some of the biggest hits come in, and you're like, oh shit, this album is really good. It keeps delivering.
The thing that hit me that I did not know as I was doing research on this today is this album had 8 singles, and Porcelain was the 6th. Like, Porcelain's the song that I go like, oh, that's the song, right? Like, that's your second or third single, and that's the one that hits. That's the 6th single on the album. I mean, it's shocking. The thing that I remember most, that the Porcelain thing for me, is the trailer for The Beach. Do you remember
Yeah, of course.
And when they see the beach in the trailer and Porcelain kicks in, there is something about the songs that are also, I think one of the people talked about, as I was sort of doing research, about the label later clarified that the licensing actually came as a result of agencies asking for permission to use the music as sound beds, attributing the music's popularity to its evocative and emotional nature. It feels very, I mean, I'm sure it's played in spas to this day. Like, it has a very calming sort of component to it that also it's understandable why commercials would want it. It puts you at ease.
Yeah. Look, when just personally, I'm sitting in a cubicle for the first time in my life, and I want to blow my brains out. And so that I put the CD in the CD-ROM of the computer and listen to it on my headphones. And it takes me away to wherever I could imagine. And like when 95, 96, 97, I'm super into, not only am I into college music, but I'm into female singer-songwriters. And somehow this combines all of it and makes it this thing where I can just pretend I'm not where I am. And he did a really good job with that.
I can't disagree with any of that. And yet, at the same time, I do find myself, when I listen to it today, when I think about this album, it feels like everything that a movie like Fight Club hates. Do you know what I mean?
For sure.
Like, it feels like the antithesis of everything that sort of, like, 99, for all intents and purposes, Kenny and I have obviously kind of expounded on this, but this idea of it's the end of the millennium, it's the turning of the millennium, it's this, it feels like we're turning a page on something. We're seeing this sort of flood of very interesting filmmakers. The Sopranos is coming out, which is going to revolutionize television. I mean, there are just seismic things that are happening in pop culture in this moment. And right around the corner is, unfortunately, September 11th is not that far away. And it feels like, and then you have this big sort of explosion of the New York scene, New York music scene of, you got your Strokes and your Yeah Yeah Yeahs and the LCD Sound System, various things that are coming out of New York. This album feels like a little bit of the calm before the storm a little bit. This idea of like, it's all going to be okay. Like if there was a song that would play over a montage of 1999, it might very well be Porcelain or something to that effect.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But like, does a revolutionary band like LCD Sound System exist if Moby doesn't blow up for this one album? Because when you think about it, even when I'm listening to it now, I've been listening to, since we agreed on this album, I've been listening to it nonstop, and for better or for worse. Like I'm like, nope, get through this. But how did that make it to, like, what radio station are you like, this is the station that's going to play Moby? And somehow it was every station. So whether I was listening to my like local little indie rock station on the Jersey Shore or the Z100 in New York, the biggest station there, it was playing. So, I mean, he broke every barrier somehow, whether he wanted to or not, whether that was his intention or not.
Yeah, it's one of those things too, where it feels a little bit like the moment of understanding. It's really the selling it to commercials, and I don't want to keep harping on this, but I think it's something that needs to be sort of explained a little bit, just in the sense of like. So there's this great quote in Wired magazine where they said the songs on Play, which became the first album to have all of its tracks licensed for use in films, television, music, or commercials, have been sold hundreds of times. A licensing venture so staggeringly lucrative that the album was a financial success months before it even reached multi-platinum sales totals. So I guess what I'm saying is, when this album drops, it's kind of a shrug. Like, it doesn't really get much play. Mm-hmm. It debuts, I believe it debuts relatively low in the UK. It debuts at 33 on the UK album charts. So they're kind of like, who cares?
Right.
It's kind of a shrug. And then they find this weird backdoor, side door way into planting these fucking songs in our subconscious to such a degree that every DJ in town is like, yeah, no, we got to play this now. Like, they essentially program us. It feels a little bit like Josie and the Pussycats in the movie, where like there's like this subliminal messaging of like, play Moby, and then everyone starts to play Moby.
Yeah. But like,
it's not to take anything away from the music still has to be good, I think, is your point.
Sure.
And it's a valid one.
It also, I mean, so in 99, if Brad Pitt shows up in a television commercial, Brad Pitt's canceled, unless he's in Japan. So this is the beginning of like, maybe the beginning of the end. Maybe Moby is responsible for all that. His birthday is September 11th, by the way. So,
there's something, yeah.
There's something there. It is like the beginning of like, well, maybe we can sell out a little bit and still be okay. Because you have Eminem then the next year or whatever calling him out, or maybe it's that year at the Music Awards, calling him out like straight up in a song. But Eminem sold out as much as anybody else did. So I mean, I don't know whether he was a revolutionary for doing it or just lucked into it.
Well, I mean, this is worth unpacking a little bit, because I do think that part of this fulcrum point of 99 is about sort of choices that have to be made, creative integrity that have to be made at a certain point, because these industries, slowly but surely, with file sharing and the various other sort of piracy things that start to come into play, you get into a situation where these businesses have no choice but to find other revenue streams. Now, I'm not crying in my cheers for any of these multi conglomerate companies that are obviously making a shit ton of money, but I do think that they had to be more creative about finding ways to find success musically and in TV and in movies as well. And I think that artists have to grapple with that. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a real kind of moment where they have to ask themselves, why am I doing this? Like, if this is just a money-making venture, then great. But if I'm trying to say something or do something, you have bands like Rage Against the Machine has an album. We did an episode with our friend Rich Monahan about
never heard of him.
Never heard of that guy. About they wanted to fucking say something, right? And when it became clear that they couldn't really, or that there was friction in the band or whatever the case might be, they disbanded, obviously. But I just think that it's very interesting to see a guy like Moby who does have something to say. He puts a lot of his money into animal rights organizations and deserves a ton of credit for that. But to your point, I remember when Blur sold Song 2, you couldn't get away from that fucking song. Like that song was again another ubiquitous song that was just like fucking everywhere.
Right.
And a lot of people were like fucking sellouts. And I'm just like, are they? Like, I don't know. I mean, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, but then a lot of people were like, wait, who's Blur? This song's awesome. And then wound up following Blur. Do the Gorillaz happen if Song 2 doesn't happen? Yeah. Even like, in that same year, Rage Against the Machine saying something, and then at the end of The Matrix, their song kicks in. So they fucking sold it too. So, and at the time, just doing some research on Moby, he was destitute. He was living in the basement of an abandoned warehouse. And so I was listening, Rich Monahan, never heard of him, sent me a link to another podcast that he had listened to called Heavyweight. And did you listen to this episode? There's this episode where the host is friends with this guy in New York who was friends with Moby at the time.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Moby, Moby's a destitute musician. He's got some DJ things. He's like, he blew up overseas, made zero money from it. Even like reading some other facts, like from Go, he made like $2,000. You know what I mean? Like he just made nothing in residuals. So this guy is like, hey, my dad and I found this box set, ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax, Sounds of the South DVD or CD set, and he lends it to Moby, and that exploded the album. The podcast is amazing because 20 years later, the guy's still butthurt that Moby has his CD set. He's like devastated by it, and they go to LA, and he hasn't talked to Moby in 20 years. It's you have to listen to it. It's incredible. Sorry to pitch someone else's podcast, but I'll send you the link. It's so great.
That sounds awesome.
But Natural Blues and sometimes both use those. So the track or the album opens up with this Sounds of the South sample. So I feel like for him to sell out at that point in time, he was like, "Fuck it, I've been doing this for 20 years. I'm living in the basement of a warehouse. Yes, give me the money." And there isn't one major actor that doesn't say do one for them and then one for me. Mm-hmm. So.
No, I mean, listen, I'm not here really judging Moby for making money off of this or for sort of, just figuring out a way to build a career. I mean, there are arguments to be made for, so there's some appropriation going on here in terms of some of these songs.
100%.
And him sort of, manipulating them there is a very strong argument to be made for that. And I would like to think that Moby has dedicated some of his money back. I mean, I know that he's given it to some of the families of the people from these songs, but still, it's a choice. That being said, it's incredibly powerful. These voices and these clips and samples that he uses, they really, really stick with you, and they're really beautiful. And I mean, of all people, but Adele said that a major influence on her 2015 album 25 was Play. She said, "There's something that I find really holy about that album, the way it makes me feel, even though there's nothing holy or preachy about it. There's just something about it, maybe the gospel samples, but it makes me feel alive, that album still. And I remember my mom having that record." That makes me feel really old, but I also think that, but there's something there, right? Which is that there is something, I don't want to say universal because that feels so pedantic, but I just think that he was trying to make something that felt human, I guess, that felt like it transcended any sort of genres, and that it kind of broke outside of what we had heard up until that time. It also makes me think of someone like Girl Talk, or various sort of other people that have come off of this, DJs and what have you, who have found ways to sample and ways to sort of mix all this stuff together. Rolling Stone at the time said that the ebb and flow of 18 concise, contrasting cuts writes a story about Moby's beautifully conflicted interior world while giving the outside planet beats and tunes on which to groove. I mean, sounds like 1999. The Rolling Stone Pitchfork said the raw magnetism of the sampled recordings was lost to innate digital recording techniques, resulting in music that was fun and functional yet disposable, which I think there's something to that. I think that it really should be underscored a little bit, to your point, how unpopular Moby was.
Right, yeah.
When this album comes out.
He's a 135-pound, at the time, 35-year-old bald man. So, he's fighting against... It's a very uphill battle for this dude. And again, I don't feel for him or anything. I just feel like, he found a way, and I can't blame him for that. If you think about how many, I don't know Monet's, background, but if I'm looking at his paintings, even then I'm just like, oh, okay, I get it. He sold out. So it's always so, it's a personal opinion. For me, okay, I'm going to put you in another scenario. I have my first job. So I buy my first car, which is, they're re-releasing the Volkswagen Jetta at the time. It's 1999, and I'm buying a 2000, because that's the way years work in cars.
Yes,
get them from the future. I'm buying the new 2000 Jetta with, I have a custom made. It's a black leather interior, which goes against everything Moby stands for, but I didn't know at the time. Black and leather interior. Now. Yeah, again, me. Black leather interior, black car. It's a stick shift because I want to feel cool. And I put that in, and I'm driving in and out of the city, and it makes me feel smart, and it makes me feel sexy, and I don't know why. I cannot explain it, but that is I can literally picture the blue dash lighting up my face and thinking I'm in every commercial that these Moby songs are in. And it really was.
It's Volkswagen commercials.
I know. Isn't that great? I did not buy it because of Moby, but
it really goes to show the power of synergy, right? The power of I don't want to sound like I'm pro commercials here necessarily, but a very good commercial is selling you a lifestyle, right? It is selling you your future you in the hopes of what you want to be. And the idea of, I had that Jetta as well, so I get it.
Yes.
I didn't have leather interior and a stick shift because I don't know how to drive stick, but but I did have that Jetta, and I do feel like, we're talking about sort of this real synergy of a moment. Volkswagen was having a moment. Everything was sort of cresting a little bit, which is why we love talking about 99, because it does feel like this real crest moment of so many things. And it's, it's the idea of a good needle drop, man. Like there's nothing like it. You know, we can talk about any number of them in movies and TV shows that we love, where that moment when it all kind of comes together, where audio and visual and character arcs and all of it just crescendo into this thing. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. And, you know, just even thinking about that, like this just popped into my head when you said that, is every time I was a part of a moment. So like, you know, I started going to college in 1995. And so it's the ska movement at the time. And I think I'm part of something very small and special until I talk about it 20 years later. And everyone was a part of this ridiculous thing. So, you know, each time you're like part of this thing, are you really part of a small or is it just, or are we all buying into that moment? Is someone selling us something and we're buying it? And so, you know, it's a very fine line to walk. I always thought I was cooler than I was.
I mean, listen, I wouldn't have got out of bed in the morning if I didn't have some sense of feeling some confidence, right? I mean, I think
Sure.
I think that everyone is believing in themselves and buying into themselves to some degree or another. I just think it's interesting that Moby at this time, he recounts where he was saying, first show that I did on the tour for Play was in the basement of a Virgin Megastore in Union Square, literally playing music while people were waiting in line buying CDs. Maybe 40 people came to the show. I mean, it was just no one cared. Yeah. And it's just fascinating that he then starts to talk about how, like, so January 2000, the album re-enters the UK chart. So it's released in May of 99. Mm-hmm. 6 months later, it comes back into the UK charts. Almost a year after it came out, Moby said, it's 2000. I'm opening up for Bush on an MTV campus invasion tour. It was degrading for the most part. The audience had less than no interest in me. February 2000, I'm in Minnesota. I was depressed. My manager calls me to tell me the Play was #1 in the UK and that it had beat out Santana's Supernatural, another gigantic album that was away from. And I was like, but the record came out 10 months ago. And that's when they were like, all of a sudden things were different. Then it was #1 in France and Australia and Germany. It just kept piling on. The week Play was released, it sold worldwide 6,000 copies. 11 months after Play was released, it was selling 150,000 copies a week. I was on tour constantly, drunk pretty much the entire time. It was all just a blur. All of a sudden, movie stars started coming to my concerts. I started getting invited to fancy parties. And suddenly the journalists who wouldn't return my publicist calls were talking about doing cover stories. It was a really odd phenomenon. Play would eventually become the biggest selling electronica album of all time with over 12 million copies sold. In 2003 and 2012, the album was ranked 341 on Rolling Stone's magazine of the greatest albums of all time. And according to Spin, Play was the high watermark for populist electronica and a millennial roots and blues masterwork. Chicago, we're both kind of going like, I mean, sure. It was a different time. Chicago Sun-Times critic noted its incorporation of such disparate, that is, musical influences such as early blues, African-American folk music, gospel, hip-hop, disco, and techno, all within the context of its own distinctly melodic ambient stylings. It's really, and then obviously 12 music videos were commissioned for a total of 8 different singles produced by a number of directors, including Jonas Åkerlund, Roman Coppola, Joseph Kahn, and David LaChapelle. I mean, it's one of those albums that, as we've said, was gigantic. You couldn't get away from it. And then at a certain point, people just started stripping it for parts, right? Like other musicians start coming at it and saying, like, what can I pull from this?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But, one of the things that I found very cool just today is I'm in my car and I'm listening to it again. And my wife and I are going to get coffee. And as you know, she's 10 years younger than me. And she knows every song. And she's, and she's 12 at the time, where I'm 22. So it spanned so many generations too. It's the earworm that it planted is still not gone.
Yeah, I literally hit play, no pun intended, and when that first sample comes in, and I was just like, wow. I mean, it's a time capsule. Like it really takes you back, and it feels good. I mean, there's another quote that I want to read here really quick from Wandering Sound. Robert Christgau wrote, although some techno-futurists will disparage the gorgeous play, it qualified as a futurist work simply by redefining the concept of commercial. Moby's handlers swamped the mass market through the side door, placing swatches of all 18 songs, mostly many times over, on movie and TV soundtracks, ads for the likes of Volkswagen, Bailey's Irish Cream, American Express. FM exposure followed. But the main reason the album will sound familiar is the way Beethoven's Ninth does to a classic ignoramus, is the little bits of it that have seeped into Americans' brains. For this be grateful, because those bits are intensely pleasurable as melody or texture or sometimes beat, and because Moby has ordered, placed, and segued them into and their intimate surroundings into something that suggests a surging and receding whole. I do think there's something like, listen, Beethoven's Ninth is Beethoven's Ninth. I mean, you can't. It's pretty untouchable, but it's also just it shows the evolution of how we process and ingest music now, right? I mean, it's everywhere. It's in all sorts of different places. It's at the fucking gas station. I mean, it is everywhere. And good music gets in your bones. And this is just it's good music. Yeah,
and I think if he wasn't a really good musician, this wouldn't be a conversation because no one would know who he is. His later stuff, his ambient stuff or relaxation stuff that came in the last 5 years or so is him on a piano or an acoustic guitar, and he knows what he's doing. So composer-wise and musicianship-wise, if he doesn't crush it on this album, nobody gives a shit, and we never know that it exists.
It's funny today, and I sent this to you. Somebody tweeted at me a acoustic version of Porcelain that she did performed with Moby, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's really beautiful. But it also goes to show how flexible and malleable the songs he created were as well. Yeah. I mean, this is the talent of, and I guess there's a universality to it, but it's that idea of making a song that's bulletproof, making a song that no matter how you fuck with it, it's just great. And he somehow made like 15 of them. It's pretty incredible.
I mean, name another musician who can really do that. Honestly, like they're even. Let's say the Beatles are the greatest band ever, or the Rolling Stones. We can take either one of them. They have albums where I'm like, I guess, like I'll listen to it, and I love them both. I mean, they're two of my favorite bands. But to have an 18-track album where you're just like invested the entire time, and it puts you in a mood. He tells a story. He does everything an artist is supposed to do. He tells a story from start to finish. You're on a journey. You're satisfied when it's over. It really is a lovelier album than I ever imagined it was in 1999.
It's also, this quote that I read is talks about ordered, paced, segued them. The track listing, the album is such that it really just flows into itself, right? Like it really feels like sort of one big 15-piece song, if you want to think about it that way. And I think that's also, this is something that I think you and I might be part of the last generation to respect the album. Yeah. The idea of the album. Yeah. Perhaps the last generation that spent, or certainly that spent as much as we did on a single album, and then dedicated yourself to listening to it because you spent so much on it. Like even if it was filled with a bunch of stinkers, you were just like, I'm gonna fucking listen to this thing because I spent almost $20 of my hard-earned money on it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like the musicians at that time kind of even knew that, they were, it's usually the label that's like, no, we need to shove more nonsense onto here so that it sells. When I was reading the sellout part of the Moby story today, I kind of put myself in that position where it's just like, okay, do I want to, do I try to be smart about the roles that I take? And I do, but also I'm 43 years old and I live in an apartment in Los Angeles. I don't own a home. I'm not wealthy. So if someone said, look, Pete, you're going to be the lead of the adult Maze Runner, and you're going to make $1 quadrillion, and you're not going to really love the story. Am I going to consider it? Absolutely. Especially, he sold all of that stuff before he got the FM play. So I feel like it was his last ditch effort. People are like, the label's like, look, this isn't going to go anywhere, but you could make millions of dollars just by selling the songs. And nobody even needs to know who Moby is. And maybe that was what was in his head. And then all of a sudden, he's like, wait, it's on the charts 11 months later? That's insane. And then he had to deal with being Moby, which is crazy. That's a weird thing to, yeah.
Moby. It's interesting too, because he's also a little bit of the architect of kind of Bowie's last surge. You know what I mean? Like he's got, and I just want to be 100% sure that I'm right in this timeline. I think that I am. But Heathen, which was a Bowie album that came out in, I believe, 2000. But let me just make sure that I'm completely right in that. Heathen comes out in 2002. Yeah. So he is. So Heathen, Reality, The Next Day, and Black Star are Bowie's last 4 albums, and right. Heathen was the first kind of like, wait a second, Bowie's got a good album. Because like Hours comes out in 99, and we'll do an episode on Hours and how it's sort of kind of it's not a great album. It's fine, but it's right. Kind of a shrug. Bowie he tours with Moby. I mean, his last tour is with Moby. Yeah. He recognizes something. I mean, again, like there was no one that sort of, I would argue, that was able to sort of put his finger to the weather and figure out where the winds are turning. But he sort of looked at Moby and saw an opportunity. And I say all of this to say that, yes, Moby had one gigantic album and didn't really do much afterwards in terms of like his own stuff. But he produced a bunch of stuff. He obviously used his fame in positive ways. But he was a moment. He was definitely the architect of a moment. And I think that people should, give him his due in that time. But I also think too that, as I was listening to this album, I was thinking about what it did to sort of electronic music. But then I would also say, like, there's good and bad that came from it, right? I mean, rock and roll gets a big push in the early 2000s. Some might argue the last push it might have. Who knows?
I think, kind of.
But it's, electronic music for a very long time, people looked down their nose at it. That it was the association to disco. It was the association to dance, and that somehow that wasn't good music, which I think is absurd in and of its own right.
Sure.
But I don't know. I think that it's, so I want to ask you sort of about the sampling thing for a second, because it does feel like, hip hop and rap really kind of are the only other genre of music that I can think of that uses samples in the same way that electronic music does. And I guess I sort of wonder whether or not they're speaking to each other in some way. I mean, are these genres sort of elevating each other in different ways?
I think so. I mean, just given the idea of how hip hop started and how electronica started, almost kind of have the same street feel, I mean, is electronica hip hop for white guys? Maybe, because, it's just like, okay, I found this thing. I can't make my way into the hip hop world, even though I love it. And so here's like a kind of side door. I don't know. I'm just kind of, that's conjecture for sure.
We're just talking. I think that for me, I would say that the reason that electronic music is generally discarded, or at least dismissed, is that there's an argument to be made for whether the lyrical content of dance music is as strong. It's certainly not as strong as hip hop and rap, and that music tends to be of a far more, it's speaking a lot more to politics and telling stories in a way that is far richer, in my opinion, than dance music. That being said, the pleasure that it brings people on the dance floor should not be dismissed, because I think that that's a very important thing too. I just think it's interesting how, to your point, they're both very different and speak to very different audiences to a certain degree. And yet they kind of also talk to each other as well. I think it's why some people, took some, I don't want to say offense is the wrong word, but some people feeling like the appropriation of some of this music felt odd or
sure. And I never even thought about that until I was reading about it. But I will say that, like, on the other hand, and I'm not defending it because, but that cultural appropriation was barely a term back then. Right. And I feel like he was just like, oh, this is incredible. Somebody exposed me to this. Let me expose the world to it. Or at least that's how I thought of it at the time. So I thought he was like kind of lending a hand to, or paying tribute to, that genre, or, like at the time, if you listen to NPR, they always had a world music, section. And so I kind of felt it was that. It was like, okay, let me take this to the next level and show it to other people. And again, I don't think he thought he was going to have the success that he had. So I don't think he thought he was stealing anything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so either. And I mean, you mentioned NPR. NPR named Play one of the 300 most important American records of the 20th century, as determined by the network's news and cultural programming staff, prominent critics, and scholars. I think that I think it's an important album, and it might be important in some negative ways too. But I think it's an important album, and I think that it's so funny because when you texted me and said that you wanted to do this album, I thought to myself, okay. I mean, Moby, sure, Moby. Like, yeah. He's not a guy obviously that I think about. It's not music that I've listened to in a while. And then I do this, I listen to it and doing this deep dive. I see that he did kind of leave a footprint. I mean, this album did change music, even if only sort of in its time, but also just in terms of licensing and in terms of just the way people hear music, which I don't think is a bad thing. I mean, I know that there are people that think that, hearing their song in a Bailey's Irish Cream ad might not be what they wanted out of life, but people are hearing your song. Isn't that a good thing?
Yeah. And look, in 1999, maybe it was the biggest thing. Like, it was a huge deal. Now everybody has their fucking fingerprints on anything they can leave it on. Legitimately anything. I mean, I lose commercials or voiceover jobs to A-list celebrities. That's ridiculous. That in 1999, that was not a thing. I mean, I don't know, man. It's a very. I'm getting angry about him yelling at you. Apparently,
no. I mean, I understand. Listen, I understand your frustration because it does feel like, there's just the frustrations I think come from, we all want to be working and we all want to be expressing ourselves. I mean, I speak for the people, obviously, in the fields that we work in, but still, I just think that. The commercials are just another way of expressing yourself, and admittedly, it's advertising. And listen, we can have a whole discussion about capitalism and corporate America and all that sort of thing. But I do think that it's, I just think it's an interesting moment, and I'm obviously happy that you picked the album because it made me come at 99 in a different way that I hadn't thought about before. It made me re-listen to this album, and it made me rethink about. Excuse me, it made me rethink about Moby in general. It's unfortunate that, the most recent time I'm thinking about Moby is when he's lying about dating Natalie Portman.
Right. But what artist, guys, a wig just fell in. What artist is not polarizing in some way? You just think about. I feel like the Rolling Stones did the same thing when their first song went into a commercial. But like every artist that I think of and respect in any is Moby the Andy Warhol of 1999? I mean, maybe. It just every one of them. It has some polarizing thing about them. So I don't know, man.
Well, I think you're also tapping into something that I think is worth saying too. And this is something that's become more and more prevalent as things continue. But, we're talking about the commodification of creativity here. We're talking about people that are trying to make money off of art. And I commend artists. And when I say artists, I include writers, musicians, the whole gamut of people that want to put their artistic integrity at the top of the list, that to them it's more important that they're saying something and that they're putting good art out into the world than it is to make a buck. And I understand the alternative to that. I understand a person on the other end of the spectrum that's like, I got to support myself. I got to pay for my, keep food on the table for my family or whatever. People that need private jets that I have less respect for.
Right.
But, this idea of trying to be successful, whatever that means to you, through your art, I think is, I think that's legitimate. And I think that's something that we should all commend. It's commendable.
Yeah. And it's also, isn't it kind of a side effect of the art? So I let's say I'm a musician, because you wanted to label me that at first. And believe me, I'm just a dude in his living room with an acoustic guitar.
I was willing to give you the benefit
that was lovely. Today I looked up some Moby chords just once you sent me that violin thing, and I was like, oh, these are fun to play. I'm gonna actually record. Awesome. Yeah. But anyway, if I'm a musician and I'm recording music because I love music, and someone picks up on that music, the side effect is that it goes out to the masses and that everyone loves that music. So the capitalist society that we live in dictates that I make money from that, and I'm not mad at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think that it's interesting. When I read the sentence that I read earlier about every track being licensed, when I read it before we went on mic, I did kind of take a second and go like, okay, all right. And then, hindsight being what it is and talking with you about it, I have to say that, I mean, I get it. And it's a different way to get people to hear your music. And I think that if you love your music and you want to get people to hear your music, then you should just put it out there in any way that you can. I think that it's messy and it's weird. And I don't know if you've heard, I love this story because it's a great story. But have you heard the Arcade Fire story about, so there was a pilot years ago called the Black Donnellys, I believe.
Yeah, I remember that.
It was a Paul Haggis pilot.
Yep.
And as you know, being in the business, when a pilot gets shot, it's temp scored, right? So you shoot your pilot, you put your pilot together, and then you get to basically make your wish list with your editor, and you put a whole bunch of music into that pilot before it gets sent to the network to make the decision as to whether or not they're going to make a series out of this thing.
Right.
So he makes this pilot, he shoots this pilot, and he puts Arcade Fire's Rebellion Lies at the very end of the pilot. As sort of this big crescendo moment. It's this big needle drop where like all these four stories are, I've seen the pilot, all these four stories are coming together. And he puts that song on there. And then the pilot gets picked up to series. So at this point, now it's like, I got to get the music rights to all the songs that I had in this thing. So they reach out to Arcade Fire. They say, we're not interested. And Paul Haggis is like, no. Like, I have an Academy Award and I am going to get Arcade Fire. And listen, nothing against Paul Haggis. It is what it is. I'm not a big fan of Crash, but it is what it is.
Sure.
So he calls up Arcade Fire, or their manager, and says like, hey, I really want to use this song. And the manager says, listen, they really appreciate it. They think it's really lovely that you want to use their song, but they're just not interested. And he's like, fuck it. I'm getting on a plane. I'm coming to Montreal. I'm going to show them the pilot with the song in there at the end. And when they see it, they're going to get it. So he flies to Montreal. He screens the pilot for them and they still say no. And I think it's fucking hilarious that he sat in a room with these guys.
Yeah.
He played the fucking thing for them. And they're like, listen, they're apparently very nice. They're like, it's a really good pilot. We just don't want to license our music to this thing. He ultimately, I think, went with Snow Patrol, if I'm not mistaken, which, I mean, is what it is. Yeah. But I just think that I say all of this because I think that both sides are understandable. If a band wants to hold on to their music and say, like, listen, we're not interested in, they would subsequently license their music to David Fincher for Benjamin Button and 6 Feet Under. So clearly they have people that they want to work with and people that they don't. But I think you understand my point, right? I think we all have our lines in the sand.
Absolutely. And I don't blame or fault people if their line is different than mine. maybe I'll be angry and jealous about it, but I don't fault them. And like, look, I think Moby, his stuff being licensed so much led to the OC having a soundtrack that like was mind blowing in the early 2000s and that everyone loved. Like, I think it led to good things. And then it also led to shitty things. It also led to everything being licensed for everything. And maybe electronica is faulted for the downfall of music altogether. I don't know.
I mean, I think that, I mean, personally, I'm a fan of electronic music. I think what I like most about electronica or electronic music or whatever you want to call it, is that it sort of feels like the futuristic version of what we've been doing all along, right? Which is putting your voice into it, recording your voice, recording an instrument, and playing around with it and trying to. To me, it feels like the obvious evolution of where we're going technologically, and I don't know. I'm a big fan of it.
Well, look at Bon Iver. You know, you're talking about a singer-songwriter who has somehow made auto-tune bearable, because when it first came out, I was like, what the fuck is this? You don't have to be able to sing anymore. But then a guy who I know can sing puts it in his album, and now his albums are like, they're mind-blowing. And the future thing is such an interesting point, because with all of that music, I really do feel like each song has chosen an emotion and they're mainlining that emotion into my brain. So like, I need to feel relaxed. I'm going to hit the relax button on my, whatever head pod, and it is going to make me feel that emotion. And they're really good. They're really good at it.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I remember when, and I'm sure you do too, when Kid A came out.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And that is another kind of touchstone moment for me musically, because I remember everyone thinking, well, they just destroyed the band. Like, they just blew themselves up from the inside. I mean, Tom York's voice, for all intents and purposes, is not his voice through most of that album. They're fucking with it. They're doing all sorts of shit to it. And it was really sort of the deconstruction of themselves and saying, like, with the success of OK Computer, they didn't really know what the next step was for all intents and purposes. And they kind of just decided to break themselves apart, for lack of a better way of putting it. And I remember listening to Kid A for the first time and being like, I don't know that I get this. Like, at first, I just really didn't get it. It felt like, and I had a similar feeling with Bon Iver's second to last album, where he did something very similar as well.
I like that you don't even know what it's actually called, because there's symbols in it, and
a bunch of fucking symbols. But I respect it. I respect someone that says, and I would argue that both of them are going through a similar thing of colossal fame and unsure how to process that, which I imagine has to be a harrowing experience of. Yeah, I don't know if you've watched Soul yet by any chance.
No, I'm saving it for this week. Yeah.
It's very, very good. One of the themes of it, which gives nothing away, is just this idea of massive success might feel a lot different than you think it's going to.
Sure.
This idea of what you're longing for. And I think that idea, Radiohead and Bon Iver struggled with that as well, and decided artistically to sort of dive into the abyss, right? What's down there, and let's just go somewhere that no one's gone before, and who knows what's on the other side of it. Now, both of them, being the tremendous artists that they are, came out on the other side with something much more interesting. Some people, there have been a lot of people that have not.
Right. Oh, absolutely. But Kid A is hands down my favorite Radiohead album. But my take on it, and this is, I was like, wait, please tell me Kid A came out in 1999 and no one's done it yet. And it did not. Because it's my greatest concert memory. Like, everything about that.
You saw that live? I didn't see them live on that one.
Okay, so I saw it at Liberty State Park with a lightning storm in the background of New York City. It was just the most incredible thing ever. But the way that I was looking at it was like, their album before was literally called OK Computer. So now the computer kind of took over, and here we go. And I was so into it. I still listen to it nonstop today. Like
my favorite Radiohead album changes on it feels like on a daily basis.
That's fair
for all intents, but I think that gun to my head is probably still going to be OK Computer, but Kid A is probably very, very close second. It's a fascinating album. It's a beautiful album. We could talk for 5 hours about Radiohead and specifically that album, but I do think that the reason that I bring them up really does connect back to Moby and to Play in the sense of the manipulation of his own voice, which he does a fair amount of. I mean, he's not the greatest singer in the world. No. He's got a fine voice, but he is messing with it to some degree.
He was a punk rock vocalist, so it's not like he was trying to be a good singer.
But then you've got someone like Justin Vernon and Tom York, who both have exquisite voices, and they're trying to do the opposite. They're trying to fuck with their voices to make it sound worse.
Yeah.
Whereas Moby's trying to make them sound better. I just think I think that it's, I don't know. I think about, and I'm going to bring this back to Bjork for a quick second here, which is, she makes 2 very successful albums, and similarly, the fame that came off of Post was terrifying. She got like bomb threats. She had people attacking her and her children. Like it was crazy.
Yeah.
So she just went back to zero, right? She was just like, I'm going back to the beginning. And there are pictures and video of her sitting on like a beach in Iceland, just recording into a computer and just like fucking around with her voice and just trying to find the music there. To me, like, there's nothing more primal than that. That's no different than someone beating a drum or strumming a guitar or something like along those lines.
Absolutely, man. And like, we haven't even mentioned this yet, but it kind of launched Gwen Stefani's solo career.
It did.
She was, and I feel like for the same reason, she, no doubt blew up after years of them being this underground punk band. No one gave a shit about the rest of the band. It was Gwen Stefani, and she didn't know how to deal with this success. And he brought her on to do Southside, and like it was huge. And no one thought of her as a solo artist at that point.
It's the only single that actually got on the Billboard Hot 100, reaching 14 from the 8 singles that were on the album.
Wow.
This was the 7th single, and it got on to the Hot 100. Which again, this speaks to something that I think is worth talking about a little bit too, just in terms of how music has evolved and changed too, which is, albums similar to movies had legs, right? They stuck around for a while. Now it's all about the immediacy of it. How much can we make as quickly as is humanly possible and get the fuck out of Dodge? Now there are obviously your standouts, your Beyoncé's, your Taylor Swift's, or whoever's, who obviously their albums are so massive that they stick around for a long time and they can continue to sort of pump out singles. But again, like singles don't mean what they used to mean, and music videos don't mean what they used to mean. Like all these things are just not what they used to be. But the idea of an album having 8 singles, I mean, I think about like, we've been texting a fair amount about Counting Crows, for instance. I think about, August and Everything After, which has like 5 or 6 singles, if I'm not mistaken. Jagged Little Pill has like 5. I mean, this was the time of albums spawning multiple songs. Today, if you squeeze out 2 or 3 singles off an album, you're golden.
Yeah, and I feel like someone like Taylor Swift is like the exception there, where you have an artist. I feel like there's, the definition of artist has really changed too. A lot of people are in the game per se to make a quick buck and get out. And then some people are musicians or artists, and they're really trying hard. Like, look, I want to be on the cutting edge of pop music and hip hop. And then I listen, like I'll hear a car next to my car with a song on, and there's no music. Like it's just sounds, and it's not even good. It's not complicated. It's just one simple beat and someone who can't sing or rap or do anything. And I'm so confused by it. And maybe it's because I'm 43 and I'm fine if I'm just old and angry. That's fine. But like, I just feel like the art of the artist is also lost on a lot of people now.
Yeah. I mean, it is really interesting because I keep thinking about, the sort of, there's a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of component to everything that we do in pop culture, it feels like. and it all kind of comes back around again. I think that I remember reading this article in the New York Times a few years ago where they were talking about how Gen Z is really into things they call tactiles. And we used to know them as books and records. So there's something just very interesting about how, yes, there's this sort of instant gratification, this, I was texting with Kenny the other day. He said to me, there's no monoculture anymore. And I was like, actually, I think there is. It's just the monoculture lasts for 48 to 72 hours. Yeah. You're all talking about the same thing, but just for a very brief amount of time before the next fucking thing comes down the pike. All of that speaks to what you're talking about, right? Which is this idea of longevity, of building something to last, seems less and less important. And that's depressing. Yeah, man. And like when I'm hoping that a car next to me is going to pull up and maybe Justin Bieber is on instead of the nonsense they're listening to, like that's where my mind is blown. And, with the 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I feel like a lot of music right now has taken the step back to like the MC Hammer Vanilla Ice era, where it's just a bunch of nothing. Like pop music in the late 80s, early 90s was just awful in that specific genre. And I feel like that's where they're back to now. I don't know why we got on that, and I'm but I do think that I think that this is an interesting time to be talking about this album, and I think it's an interesting time for you and I to be talking about music in general, because I do think that we're all trapped in our fucking houses right now. We're all stuck in a pandemic, and I do think that has given us a lot of time to think about things, a lot of time with our own thoughts, a lot of time to look inward. But I think it's also, I can only speak for myself, but I think you similarly, there were a handful of albums that came out this year that were real life raps, that really got me through, some dark times, just like feeling there was a hopelessness for lack of a better way of putting it, that kind of swallowed this country for the better part of, 7, 8 or 9 months. And, I think we've talked a lot about, our love for Phoebe Bridgers. We've talked a little bit about the Waxahachie album as well. We've talked obviously about Taylor Swift. We've talked about Fiona Apple. We've talked about these albums. So women are saving us. Women, is what you're saying. Singer-songwriters. I mean, there were other artists that I listened to this year that are men, but these were the ones that, for all intents and purposes, I listened to a lot. And I think that, all of these albums had probably something very much in common, which was grappling with sort of something bigger than themselves. This idea of, now, some of these albums were not recorded during the pandemic. In fact, Taylor's were the only ones that were actually recorded during the pandemic. But you can't tell me that the 7 or however many years it took Fiona Apple living in her house, literally using the bones of her dead dogs as instruments. Like this, she's been in her own pandemic for quite some time, and God bless her for it. I don't know that she's ever been out of it. So she's definitely always been in that. But it does. I think it's really interesting how music right now, and I bring up Phoebe Bridgers, not just because I want to talk about Phoebe Bridgers, but to talk about how she used the pandemic to launch an album, right? I mean, she had this album recorded. She didn't need to release it during the pandemic. She could have very well had sat on it if she wanted to. She ultimately decided to release it during it, and has unquestionably put on the most creative performances on late night television all year. She's weaponized all these various forms of technology. Now, admittedly, she's a lot younger, so she understands the technology probably better than anybody. But I just think that this all speaks to sort of, using technology for creative purposes. And I think that, Moby is another example of that. Like, this guy obviously stood on the shoulders of other giants and other people to make this album. I'm not suggesting he was a trailblazer for all intents and purposes, but I do think that he understood what was possible at that time. And I think that we're seeing that today from other artists using technology to make really beautiful music. Absolutely. Absolutely. And also, when it comes to trailblazers, the ones that we usually think of usually aren't the first people through the trail, unfortunately. Correct. We celebrate Christopher Columbus. He was an idiot. Like, he landed in the wrong fucking place. So,
Yeah,
Right.
he really does have to. Moby really should get that credit for. He kind of was a trailblazer at the time. There was nothing else like that exposed to the masses, and he was the least likely candidate to expose them either. It was just really the right place, the right time, and that's how. I mean, that's pretty much all of 1999, right? I mean, it really does define
A lot of things
1999.
were very much right place, right time. I mean, it is very interesting, to think about. I mean, I guess what you would say is his style of music, which is a little hard to pin down, intentionally so. I mean, he's really sort of, he's mixing all kinds of things together, but I think that from a production perspective, there was a sheen to his work. There was a, the name Porcelain for the song is a perfect name because it feels like that. It feels it feels clean and cold and inviting and just doing all these very interesting things. I think he just understands production incredibly well. Obviously, he produced a bunch of other stuff down the road as well. But yeah, it's a real alchemy. The guy had a real moment. The planets aligned for him.
Yeah,
and it's pretty special.
But even at the time, Enya was kind of blowing up, or there was that the late night commercial for whatever, I don't remember what it was called, but it was like sounds of relaxation or other. I don't remember what it was actually called. It wasn't that. And every night that commercial came on, I was like, these songs are fucking great. Like, I want to buy this thing. And so he somehow made it cool to buy that album. And I guess you're in the transition of, because I remember in 95 when I went to college, we had email on a computer screen that was still green and black. And then by the end of that first semester, there were computers in the basement of the library that got on this thing called the internet. And so he kind of came in and made it okay that technology was taking over. And I thought that I was along for the ride. It kind of helped.
Yeah. I mean, it's a friend of mine tweeted at me when I was tweeting about this album today. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of, yeah, it felt like everyone had to own that album in 1999 or 2000. It was a prerequisite. We all listened to it a bunch, and then we forgot that it ever existed. Like it felt like it was a moment. And I think that people don't give enough credence to it. They don't look at it maybe as a Rosetta Stone for electronic music in the way that maybe they should. But everyone had it. I mean, I remember that red CD with the play triangle. I mean, it was, and that cover of him jumping that green background
with the light meter is right in it. It looked like an outtake of a photo, which was so good. It just made it. All right, so let me ask you this.
Yeah,
because I feel like we're both. I don't even know how to say this, but we're both on the cooler end of the spectrum when it comes to music and movies, right, for the most part. Yeah. Was it cool? Like, was Moby cool?
I mean, I don't want to say so flatly no. I'll say this. I think that, I think you're asking a bigger question here, which is, can something that is so ubiquitous and so popular be cool?
Yes,
I think that's the
what I'm
question
asking.
That to some degree you're asking.
Yes, I am, and I want you to also consider, like, he never thought it would be that way. So, like, let's say the times were different. Commercials weren't using music. It was the 80s, and commercials had fucking jingles. This album comes out in the 80s, and it's on the underground scene only. Is it the coolest album that's ever existed at the time? Like,
yeah, 100%.
Okay.
I think that. I think that it's. I think that it would have felt like a relic. I mean, this is the thing about this, which is the album is sort of pushing and pulling in two opposite directions. This idea of taking these old, gospel, what have you, these old sort of songs, and repurposing them and putting them in ultimately the most futuristic context that existed up until that time, right? So it's history kind of like smashing into itself, which is fascinating and is part of why I think all of these music historians believe this album to be more important than perhaps people give enough credence to. That being said, it also was an incredibly successful album. It was so successful that it felt like when you were listening to it, you're like, yeah, I'm listening to this album that everyone else is listening to in this moment. And I don't know. I don't know about like, I'm trying to think about like what was cool music in 99, because truthfully, Kenny and I we did like our favorite song, the best songs of 1999. And you know, I'm doing some music episodes and we're doing some music episodes, but like, I don't know that anything was cool in music in 99.
That's
was
true.
A very strange time.
It was a very weird transition, like you said in the very beginning of this podcast, where like grunge was on its way out. Yeah. Pearl Jam, for all intents and purposes, had turned into like they were almost being played on the classic rock stations at that point, yes. And they came out 7 years before. Like it was already like, you know, everything was transitioning, and I don't think music knew what it was. So it was a really fun little moment.
Completely agree with you. It's why, you know, probably my 2 or 3 favorite albums of 99, Fiona Apple's, no surprise, When the Pawn, and Beck's Midnight Vultures, both of which are fantastic albums, but also are from artists that are sort of chameleon-like in their own way. I mean, Fiona's a little bit more in her lane, but still, like, they're pushing boundaries. They don't give a shit about what people think they're supposed to be doing or not be doing, which I think speaks to your point, which is that in 99, you were very much in a lane of like, I mean, you had Foo Fighters and you had big sort of like arena rock bands, I guess, or you were like pop music, or you were literally like Britney Spears, or Backstreet Boys, you know, and then you had like this seismic, huge fucking album that fits into no categories. So I think that I think this all speaks to what you're saying, which is this idea of, how exciting it was to listen to because it didn't feel like anything else that was out there at that time.
100%.
And it was in every fucking commercial, so you were programmed to want to listen to it.
Right, but okay, so I'm going to say this, and I saved it till the end to say it so I didn't sound like a dick, but I had that album because of the college radio station well before anybody had heard it. I actually had his album of remixes that came out a couple years before, like with the James Bond theme song and stuff like that. I used that a lot at this because I would make all of our drops. So like the commercial interstitials and stuff like that. And station identifications. I would make that and use that type of music because it was really cool. So I kind of was exposed to him a little bit earlier, but I still, you know, if you said who's Moby, I would have no fucking clue. But I got that album very early on and I was very into it very early on. And I hate ever saying that. But then when it blew up, I didn't think any differently of it. And look, picture being 22 years old in a pea coat with your headphones on, walking through the streets of New York. Nothing's fucking cooler than that moment. Nothing.
Well, and that guy's definitely listening to Moby.
Yes, 100%. Like, and that guy's definitely me, and it was great.
No, I listen, man. I hear you 100%. I remember. I mean, I'm sure you do too. Listening to CDs on a Discman. There was nothing better than just walking the streets, listening to whatever music you wanted to listen to. The evolution from your Discman, your radio, to your Walkman, to your Discman, to your whatever. It was very freeing, and this music does feel that way. It has this sort of walking on air kind of quality to it. It's really interesting, and I'll say this too. You know, I many years ago, I don't even know what year it was now, I remember being home back in Toronto for the holidays. And whenever I'm back home in Toronto, usually I'm just listening to my iPod the whole time.
Yeah.
Because I'm on the subway or I'm walking around a lot more. We don't walk much in Los Angeles. Spoiler, guys. And I remember walking around listening to the Girl Talk album at the time. I think it was the second Girl Talk album. And there's just something also about DJs that understand the sweet spot of a song, like where that best 15 seconds is, that just gives you goosebumps, and they just keep you riding on that. And that's kind of what this album is too, right? It's someone who understands, has picked these perfect little portions
Yeah.
and you're just coasting on like the endorphins of what he's giving you. It's why
100%.
DJs are so fucking good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. And like, the reason why that was used in so many commercials and movies is because it evoked that feeling. So when you're walking through the streets and you have your own score behind you, there's nothing cooler.
You feel like $1,000,000, and that's the way that the music wants you to feel, and ultimately the commercials as well. But yeah, it's really interesting, and yeah, I mean, I wish that. It's funny because I don't think that it's an album that has been reappraised recently. It doesn't feel like an album that people look back on as much as maybe they should. It's fascinating. And someone also tweeted at me about Fatboy Slim, which was also very much sort of that ilk.
Yeah.
What was it? The Rockefeller
Rockefeller Skank.
Yeah. And Praise You. I mean, those were just like, again, these were just songs that didn't fit in a genre, songs that didn't fit in a box, that just became just gargantuan successes. It was just a very, very weird time for music.
Yeah, it was very. Around that time, because we were talking about how music was so weird, and what popped in my head was that it was very genre driven, and you had to pick your genre. Because I remember when I started dating this girl in the early 2000s. I guess it was 2001. She told me this story. We both worked out at the same gym. And she said, you came out of the locker room and you had on jeans and Chucks. And that immediately I was like, okay, I like this guy. And then I went and told my friend, look, he was wearing Chucks. And her friend said, yeah, but is he like punk rock Chucks or white stripe Chucks? And I was like, whoa, and it blew my mind. And it very much holds up. Like, you had to kind of stay in your lane at the time. And this didn't make you do that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting distinction too. I mean, I think that, the White Stripes were also, their first album comes out in 1999. It's sort of the beginning of their whole very brief, but very important legacy that they had. The amount of albums they put out in such a short period of time is tremendous. Their greatest hits just came out as well.
Oh, I have the vinyl.
Yeah.
I have the tactile, I should say.
But yeah, I think that it's just a really interesting. Kenny and I don't do that many music episodes together because music is a little harder to kind of. It's a little harder to talk about. You know what I mean? When you're moving, just there's a story, there's a narrative, there's all that kind of stuff. This is a little more finicky. So I understand why, he might not want to talk about it as much as I do. But I think that 99 in music was a weird time. There's a lot of really fascinating things to unpack. This obviously being one of those albums. And I would argue that, your early 2000s, were just really weird, interesting for American music anyway. British music was sort of in a bit of a, I don't want to say, I guess a bit of a lull post Britpop and the various things that came out in the 90s. But it was a really fascinating time. And this album, I'm really thrilled that you picked it and that we were able to kind of, that you got me to listen to it again and to dig into it and think about it in a way that I truly hadn't thought about it in 20 years. So, well,
it was 3 months of toiling over what I could actually talk about as passionately. And so I guess that's really to kind of wrap things up, that it kind of, it defines the album in that, like, I'm not a Moby fan. I don't think I've talked about Moby for 20 years, but when that album was on the list, it popped up and it evoked emotions for me immediately. Yep. That I was like, I could talk for hours about this, and I don't know a shit about this guy. So,
and that's, that really, listen, I'm sure that there's a even deeper dive into this album on in terms of all the various artists that he samples and their stories, and I certainly don't want to suggest that those stories aren't worth knowing. They are. We are obviously just doing a cursory sort of version of this. I think that if if there was some industrious soul out there that decided to do a mini podcast about each song, I think that there's a story in each of these songs that I think would be fascinating in and of itself. I think that he's, say what you will about the Moby of 2020. The Moby of 1999 was a pretty fascinating guy, and I thought that he put out an album that took the world literally globally by storm. I mean, there are lots of albums that are big in the United States, and there are lots of albums that are big in other countries and what have you. But to have something that spoke so much to the planet at large is pretty insane. So, I mean, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
But again, thank you so much for coming on, dude. I really
Oh man, it was my pleasure.
Podcast like it. You want the podcast like it. 1999.